It's just good afternoon and welcome to people joining. We will be, as usual, running a poll. So for those of you who are familiar, you can go straight to the screen and use the QR reader, or you can go to slido.com and enter today's code, which is LM010422. Now, we're going to be using Slido three ways for this poll. So please do participate and give your answers. There's only 4 questions, not too difficult. As we go through Rachel's presentation today, if you have any questions, I would ask if you could please put them into Slido. You'll find the section there which says Q&A. This allows everyone to see the questions. And if you think one of those questions is a good question or one you'd have answered yourself or asked yourself, you can always push the button and that will then thumbs up it and it will come up right to the top. And lastly, we're going to be using it for feedback. So at the end, please do take a moment or two just to give feedback on today's session. It's how we all learn and how we can make things better for the future. So many thanks. So Abraham, let's put the poll up and let's take people through that. So first question is, do you have a diversity, equality and inclusion policy in your organization? So you have 3 choices. So please let's make a choice. The second question is, have you received diversity, equality and inclusion training in your organization? So the third question, is diversity, equality and inclusion monitored in your organization? 2 people have already submitted all of the questions, so we'll just go to the third one now. Do you feel comfortable that you understand what terminology is socially acceptable, i.e. relating to gender, ethnicity? So let's see what we get up to here. 7 people have completed so far. What we can do is just give it another moment, Rachel, and we'll then run through the answers. So if I can remind you, any questions you have, please put them in the Q&A that you'll find next to the polls in Slido. Okay, Abraham, let's go back to question 1 and we give the answers. Do you have a diversity, equality and inclusion policy in your organization? Well, it's good to see. Yes is the answer. Would you like to make any comment on that, Rachel, at all?
No, I've got a slide actually that I'm just going to talk through some of these. So
okay.
We gather the info first, that'd be fab.
That's good. It's higher than I would have expected, so that's good. So let's have the next question and answer then, please, Abraham. Have you received diversity, equality and inclusion training in your organization? Unfortunately, most people, the majority haven't here. So I'm sure you'll cover that, Rachel, unless you want to make any comment now.
Yeah, we'll cover that.
We'll cover that.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's have a look at the next question. Is diversity, equality and inclusion monitored in your organization? Interestingly, majority say yes. So that's positive stuff. And the last question then, please. Do you feel comfortable that you understand what terminology is socially acceptable, i.e. relating to gender, ethnicity? Oh, a bit of a split camp here. So no doubt we cover that then, Rachel, as we go through. So thank you to everyone who participated. And I'm now going to hand over to Rachel, who's got a presentation. And let me just remind you, any questions you do have as you go along, please type them into Slido. Many thanks. Over to you, Rachel.
Great. I'm just going to share my screen. I think, Howard, you need to not share if that's okay, so that I can share mine or unshare. Oh,
you should be okay now.
Yep, great.
I'll tell you if it comes up. Yep, Rachel, we're fine.
Okay, that's fab. So firstly, thank you very much for inviting me along. Secondly, the household here seems to have coughs and colds, no COVID, but so I'll apologise now if I seem to be clearing my throat or drinking quite regularly. Like that. So I'm going to try not to have this as death by PowerPoint. I really don't want that to be the case today. However, also what I wanted to do was get as much information on here so that there's a really useful document for you to take away to your business and use as a reference point, either in the near future or also later on, you know, as you maybe develop new things within your organisations. So firstly, just to, firstly, just a bit of information about me. I'm a fellow of the CIPD. I'm a HR director. I have been doing that for 2 decades, just over 2 decades now, and I currently work as an independent consultant. So I provide advice and support into a wide range of businesses. Those are a wide range of industries: manufacturing, engineering, construction, etc. I started my career though in recruitment, and when I was recruiting the engineering sector predominantly, but also have recruited in that construction sector as well. And now the area that I do predominantly is I support businesses with their HR strategy rather than the day-to-day nuts and bolts of their HR, although I get involved with that. But I'm like the HR director without the cost of a permanent HR director. So moving on for the aim today, what I would like really as the outcome is for you guys to take away some actions to ensure that your organisation has a good consideration of the benefits of diversity, equity, which in brackets is equality, and inclusion. And I'll go on to that, why that's in brackets a bit later. So we have those 4 questions. So some really interesting stats that came out of that actually. So the do you have a diversity, equality and inclusion policy in your organisation? As Howard said, actually that's really good that 86% of you do have that. That's pretty good in relation to if I went to a wider range of organisations. So you're doing well. Have you received diversity, equality and inclusion training in your organisation? So again, you know, some good stats, but more can be done. And I think the important thing when there is any training, it's not just a tick box exercise. It's about actually putting things into practice and making sure that it's relevant. The third one, diversity, equality and inclusion, is it monitored in your organisation? So we had 63% yes, 38% no. But what I find interesting there is that in most organisations, people don't necessarily know if it is being monitored. So it's great that when you're doing it and two, you're aware of it. And then that last question, do you feel comfortable that you understand what terminology is socially acceptable relating to gender and ethnicity as an example? So split, 38% yes, 38% no, 25% it's sometimes. And actually that sometimes is usually the higher area. So interesting that there are 38% of you that feel really comfortable about what you socially should and shouldn't say. So all of these 4 things we're going to cover in a little bit more detail anyway as we move through. So I wanted to take a look at DEI and actually the construction industry, and there's a really useful article by the CIOB that I put a link to actually on one of the slides later on, so that you can go and take a look at it if you want to read a little bit more. Some really interesting percentages here, though. Women, and probably not a surprise though, but women make up 15% of the UK construction industry, with approximately 2% working on site. Personally, whether it's right or wrong, I still find it slightly unusual when but don't get me wrong, I love it when I see a female plumber or electrician. I think that's fantastic, but it does still feel unusual. The Black, Asian and minority ethnic employees make up 6% of the workforce. And I think That probably varies in locations, and whenever you are looking at your statistics when it comes to DE&I, it's always worth comparing them to the location that you're in, not to UK wide. But again, that's UK statistics, 6%. The disabled employees also making up 6%. And I guess, you have to consider the industry. There are some professions within that industry. It would be really difficult for some disabilities to be able to be accommodated. However, there are lots of different disabilities, and there are also lots of different roles within the construction industry as well. So maybe a little bit more digging on that statistic would be interesting. And then when you look at LGBTQ, 60% of employees have experienced homophobic and derogatory terms at work. And I'm sure there have been instances where many of you will have seen that. So one of the statements that they made in here, the built environment is for everyone, and the more inclusive and diverse the industry can become, the more it will serve the needs of our communities. And I'll go on to a little bit later about the benefits that we can have from diversity within your workforce. So a few other bits and pieces from that report. So it's actually, there's a growing understanding within leadership and management about DEI, but actually it's not necessarily translating to on-site. So 4 things that they've commented about there is actually there's a lack of female-sized PPE, and I had this actually a while ago in that I was doing a project for Honda in Swindon, and I forget how long, but I had to wait quite a while for my size 4 safety boots to arrive, whereas if I was a normal male size of an 8 or a 9, they would have had them on the shelf for me. I guess it comes down to supply chain and that kind of thing. You're not going to have those sat on site though. Also, non-male toilets being locked and sometimes used for storage, and comments about gender, sexuality or appearance, and then minority groups seeing a lack of inclusion in conversations. And like I said before, I'm sure many of you will have come across one or more of those scenarios. So is this the case in your organisations? And if you do see any of that, what could you do about it? So why is DEI important? So I see there as being 3 areas. So there's firstly that diverse talent. So help attract new talent within the organisation. And then diversity brings different perspectives. It increases the creativity that you have, and it also enables that productive working environment. A survey by Glassdoor, I don't know if you're aware of Glassdoor, but Glassdoor is it's a bit like the TripAdvisor of the workplace. So anybody can go on to Glassdoor and review their employer, current or previous. So 76% of job seekers and employees said that a diverse workforce is an important factor when considering who to work for. So something to really take into account there. And actually we're seeing this with certainly the generation that are starting to come into the workplace now. They do their research, they do their homework on who that potential employer is. And they are happy to say no if they don't feel that they are the right employer for them for a multitude of reasons, not just down to salary these days. So secondly, competitive advantage. So better able to understand the needs of a wide range of customers and can interact with a broad client base. I guess maybe the disability could come in here. If you are working with a customer who's requiring a disability-friendly environment, having somebody who really understands that would really help. But it also helps retain staff in a competitive market as they're made to feel welcome. And that Glassdoor survey also had a stat on that. So companies with gender diverse executive teams are 25% more likely to have above average profitability. So it makes sense. And then the last one here, the commercial risk. So whenever a situation, a case goes to a tribunal, one of the first things that employment judge and the tribunal will take a look at is, did you have a policy in place? did you have a procedure in place? And importantly, had it been followed? If you don't have them, have you followed the ACAS code and done what ACAS would expect you to do? So failure to comply can actually cost a great deal of money. I always advise customers that if something is going to a tribunal, you're looking at a minimum of 12k just to get there. So we're going to start with minimising the risk. I think that the maximising potential that we'll go on to stands to get the most benefit from DEI, but we have to take into account the minimising the risk. So I'm sure you're all aware of the Equality Act 2010. There are 9 protected characteristics there that you can see on that diagram. Some that you will be very familiar with and aware of, some that you may not be quite so aware of, such as gender reassignment and marriage and civil partnership, or the civil partnership area of that, for example. So when you look at the discrimination from the Equality Act, it breaks down into 2 areas. So there are direct discrimination. So this is directly treating someone unfairly and less favourably because of a protected characteristic. So I've mentioned in here an example of somebody, a female employee, who's not been offered a promotion because they were female, but a less qualified man has then been awarded that promotion. That does happen, and it happens for various different reasons. Then we look at indirect. So that's where rules, policies, or arrangements have a less favourable effect on a particular group who share the same protected characteristic. So the example I've given here is if an organisation decides that they want to start working on a Sunday, that could actually be discriminatory against anybody in that workforce who is a Christian and would like to attend church, or, for example, on a Sunday. So the commercial risk, and I touched on this earlier. I looked at the, I was looking actually for the most recent stats, and I couldn't find anything that was any recent than the 2019-2020. But this just gives you the average and the median awards for disability discrimination, age discrimination, and also race discrimination. So I think what's worth mentioning here is that the race discrimination actually is lower than the others, but actually I think that will see an increase. And I think discrimination in total is becoming, I'm seeing a lot more cases, a lot more grievances coming through where people are just much more aware and wanting to state their claim. I mentioned the 12k legal fees, but also you need to take into account witnesses' time off and them going to tribunal to give account, etc. And don't forget the reputation element of it. As all tribunal cases now are published, they're on public record, so you could go and run a search to find out anything that has gone to a tribunal involving your company. Just put some notes there about a landmark case. It was a Kellogg Brown and Root. I don't know if anyone's aware of that business, but it was an unfair dismissal and disability discrimination scenario. There are some, it's quite a complicated case, but it was the second largest award, and it was £2 million. Well, it was in excess to £2.5 million. That was the second largest. The largest actually was £4.7 million, which was RBS and NatWest. So they're quite rare, as you can see from the averages and the medians that I've stated, but they do happen. So I mentioned earlier, and one of the questions earlier was about terminology, and yeah, it can be confusing. And I certainly, like I said, I was surprised that there was 38% feel comfortable, because sometimes I don't feel overly, I'm second guessing, am I saying the right thing? And this was a really interesting statement in an article in the HR Director in May of last year. So despite the prevalence of the Black Lives Matter conversations over the last 12 months, 40% of working professionals are also still afraid to say the word black in relation to race and ethnicity in the workplace. So interesting, 40%, and we've said 38 are not comfortable. So it sort of ties in there, which is quite good. So what terminology is socially acceptable? So the terminology BAME, Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic, it's actually no longer acceptable. It feels like that actually hasn't been around that long, but is no longer acceptable. So it is constantly evolving. So it's not a surprise that people feel like they're not sure what they should or shouldn't say. LGBTQ+, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender questioning also has queer in brackets. Now, there are lots of people who will feel very uncomfortable saying queer and feel like that's not an acceptable thing to say, but it is. And actually there's a very good explanation video of what all of those terms mean. There is a link there which you'll be able to follow on the PDF document that goes out. Gender pronouns, so they seem to be appearing a lot on LinkedIn. I'm sure some of you will have noticed that. The use of gender pronouns has actually been around quite a long time, but it's got more popular recently. So he, him, his, she, her, hers. People are using they, them, theirs if they don't want to be seen as he or she. One of the things, the practical applications of this, and actually only earlier this week, I was looking through a handbook for a company and I noticed that they were using in their documents he or she or his or her. They literally were stating his or hers. They should be using theirs because then that just covers everything. So there are some minor amends that can be made that could just cover that. There was also a link on there that will give you a bit more explanation about that if it's something that you're interested in. So scenarios we may have come across, and I'm sure these will be things that you have, at least one or two you will have come across. So changes to an employee's health that require adjustments but don't prevent them completing their duties. There's been some really interesting cases actually with this, a relatively recent one where a lady had a child in hospital and they wanted to carry on working at the bedside, and actually the employer didn't want her working, and she brought a tribunal case against them because of that. Banter. I'm sure that's something pretty much every business that I have worked for, there has been banter, and it's really difficult because actually, particularly in the construction industry, it's seen as something that sort of keeps the working day going, but it's where does that line get crossed? What is acceptable? What isn't acceptable? It really isn't easy. But one thing that I always mention to people to think about it isn't just maybe those two people or three people that are directly involved with that conversation. There could be somebody who's overhearing that conversation who could be really offended by it, and that actually can be taken into account, and grievances can be brought forward by that person who wasn't actually involved with the conversation. So also adverts stating amount of years experience, still come across this really regularly now. This role requires 5 years experience. Why does it require 5 years experience? If the hiring manager can't give a really good explanation, it really doesn't. It's about the quality of the experience that individual has, not necessarily the amount of time. Roles requiring a strong person to manage the team. So a number of years ago, while I was working in recruitment, I was recruiting for a company that I really respect the hiring manager, still in contact with him now. Went for a meeting to discuss a purchasing manager that was required. And he said, I think we need a guy in this role because, the team can be quite difficult sometimes. And I think a man would be able to handle them quite differently. And I said, well, I get your point. but that's not going to stop me putting the right female forward, or anybody forward who's got the right attributes for the role. Interestingly, and not by design, they did take on a lady in that role. She was a really strong character, ex-military, could do her job really well. And as far as I'm aware, she's still there in a senior leadership position now, sort of some 15 years on. So, so really interesting scenario. The imbalance of board level gender. So there's been lots over the last 5 years or so about increasing the percentage of female board leaders, and some really good improvements with that. But what's worth considering as well is whether the board level, the gender balance within that board level, actually is representative of the wider workforce as well. And if actually the wider workforce isn't balanced, maybe that's where you need to look at. But if you've got 50% female in your workforce, 50% male, the board should realistically look similar to that. And also then lack of promotion, because they may decide to have children in the future, and you know, I've seen a scenario, directly seen a scenario where that has been the case, and I'm sure that still happens now. I've just put a note in here as well about exceptions. So there are gender-related scenarios, so things like carers, where there might be a female carer required for a female patient. And that link there, actually, there's an article where there's 10 scenarios of dual discrimination, which if you're interested in knowing a few more of those, it's worth a quick read. So I've put together a tick list for you. So this is the risk minimisation or risk mitigation element of DEI. So a few things just to consider. So maybe review your equal opportunity policy. I'm sure you've all got one. There's a link there to ACAS, which is their standard template. So worth just double checking it. If you don't have one, so not many of you, there wasn't many of you that didn't have one, but there is a link to ACAS's diversity and inclusion policy there for you to take a look at. Doing diversity and inclusion surveys are really good to get a feel from your workforce about how well you're doing and what more you could do. And there is an example of one there that you could utilise in your organisation. I've also put in a link to the monitoring form, although most of you have already got that in place. But for those of you that haven't, or you're not sure whether you have, that's the link. We mentioned diversity and inclusion awareness training on one of the questions. Obviously, a lot of you are doing that, but worthwhile doing that regularly. It does help when something goes to a tribunal, but what they will be looking for is they will pull you apart if they feel like it's just been a tick list. So they will be looking for you to say, yes, we had training on this date, this is what was covered, this was the presentation, and after that we did this monitoring to ensure that it was being implemented. If there is incorrect language, pick it up, challenge it where you can. It's not easy, but if everybody has had their training, it makes it easier for everybody to be picking up on that and challenging people, because everybody is aware that they are allowed to pick up and challenge. If there are situations of discrimination, you must address them, and you must follow a process. If they aren't picked up and dealt with early on, they then become an issue. They can be dealt with a mediation process before it even becomes a formal grievance in a lot of cases. And then a bit more on the sort of more proactive side. So if you've got people in your organisation who have experience either of ethnic minorities, disabilities, or any other experiences that they might want to share, it always gives people more of a perspective and more empathy for the situation. And the same then for diverse guest speakers. There are lots of people out there who are happy to come to businesses and talk about their own situations, and you know, again, provide more information to people. And then also celebrating different events. Obviously, we've just had Mother's Day go recently, and there are lots of other things that are on diversity, that are related to diversity and inclusion. And actually, I've put a calendar in here that's got a number of them on there. So showing by celebrating a range of these different events means that you are embracing that diversity and inclusion. So we're just going to move on to the maximising potential side of things now. Like I mentioned before, to me, this is maybe a little more important, but certainly is where you can really benefit as an organisation. So I mentioned that I had diversity, equity, inclusion, and I had equality in brackets. So this diagram just explains what I mean here. And actually, I'm sure many of you have seen something similar to this diagram, certainly with the equality and the equity. So that first box on the left-hand side there is the equality. So there's a football match going on, there's a fence, and there are boxes for the three people spectating to be able to stand on, all the same boxes. But unfortunately, one person can't see over the fence. By having equity, so moving the boxes around so that the person who couldn't see over the fence now has two boxes, it means that everybody can see and have the same view. The aim, though, is to move where there are no barriers. So we don't really want equality or equity. We want no barriers. So by knocking down the fence and putting something that's see-through, you don't need the boxes. Another really interesting graphic that is a bit thought-provoking is this one. So diversity asks, who is in the room? Equity asks, who's trying to get in the room, but they can't? And inclusion asks, has everybody's ideas been heard? So something just worth having in the back of your mind when maybe you're seeking advice, looking to move forward, generating strategy. Who is there? Who isn't there? And who should you have there? So I mentioned earlier about the Glassdoor survey that was done. So back last year, there were 4 questions. There were lots of questions in here, but there were 4 that I found quite interesting in particular. So UK employees would not apply to a job at a company that doesn't have an inclusive culture. So that was 42% overall. Thought that was quite interesting. Goes back to what I was saying earlier about people really doing their homework on that. Similar number where there's a lack of diversity among its workforce. And less strong feeling about those that don't publicly state its goals to increase diversity amongst its workforce. But I think that will come, and I think that will become more important. So the next question, so to what extent do UK employees believe that a diverse workforce is an important factor when evaluating companies and job offers? Very long question. Overall, 72 people agreed. Interesting that the stat, though, when it came to those ethnic minorities was a lot higher. And so, what can we actually do about this? So, publicise diversity and inclusion on the website. And social media. So, having pictures, videos, statements. If you want to attract more females to your organisation, have a video, have photos, things like that. A video where you interview somebody in role, pictures on your website of people doing the jobs within your organisation. You could also move on to listing out the company objectives, so including those relating to diversity if you've got statements and things on your website. But only do this if your company can genuinely show and commit to this. There's no point stating you're going to do it when that actually isn't the case. So 2 more questions that were on there. So to what extent do UK employees believe that their employer should be doing more to increase the diversity of its workforce? So I find it quite encouraging in a way that there was 58 that agreed here, but also found it interesting that 29% neither agreed nor disagreed. So maybe that's because they don't know what they are doing to increase the diversity of the workforce. And then to what extent do UK employees feel they've been held back in their career because of their ethnic background, gender or sexual orientation? So 25% felt that they hadn't overall. But when you then look at the one that stands out, so those employees who are Black, 50%, that was a really high percentage in comparison to those other demographics that were on there. So things that you could do is using diversity statements in job adverts, and we'll talk about that. Advertise on diversity and inclusion focused job boards. We'll cover those. Publicise your metrics and objectives for improvement, and ensure that internal processes are fair, transparent, and without bias. So I mentioned diversity statement. So a good diversity statement should be honest, authentic, and aligned with your actions and values of your company. I went to try and find a construction one, and I struggled to find one that I thought was, really on point. But Boots is a really good example of that. So they've got, in effect, two statements there. Our teams, whether in stores or our support office, are amazing. So they've said, in effect, all of their team. They inspire great ideas, drive new plans forward, and help make Boots a fantastic place to work. So they're really acknowledging that it's their people that drive the business. Ensuring that we're always recruiting, retaining, and promoting a diverse mix of colleagues who are representative of the diversity in our local communities gives us a great opportunity to have access to a broad range of ideas and allows us to give you the wide mix of products you know and expect from Boots. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier about having a wide range of, a diverse range of people within your organisation gives you that competitive advantage. So something worth thinking about there if you don't have a diversity statement. Advert content. So a few points on this here. So a company, Adzuna, that involved with job boards, they looked at a whole load of job adverts, and there was a staggering 60% that showed significant male bias in their job adverts. I'm not sure 60% is particularly staggering, but it's not the best statistic, and it isn't great that 60% had that male bias. Sales consultancy and property jobs in the UK all exhibited the highest level of male bias, with maintenance, travel and consulting jobs rapidly following suit. I find it really interesting that construction wasn't mentioned in that. They stated that there are over 25,000 problem phases that cause a subconscious gender bias in job adverts. And that and Total Jobs, who also did a similar study, they looked at that number of, 76,000 job adverts over a 6-week period, and there were 478,000 gender biased words were found, an average of 6 male coded or female coded word jobs per advertisement. So why is that relevant when looking for diversity? So LinkedIn found that men apply 13% more often than women for jobs, partly because of the use of gender coded language in the job advert. It's also pretty well known that when a female is looking at a job advert, they feel like they should pretty much tick every box to be able to apply for that role. However, men will, if they hit some of them, or maybe a small amount, they'll just apply anyway and see how they get on. So but worth bearing in mind. So how can we improve those job adverts? There's actually a gender decoder tool, and that's a link to it, and it's also on the links page that I'll give you as well. And you can literally copy and paste your job advert in there, and it will tell you whether you've got certain words in there that may be gender bias. So attracting more diversity. So there's the three main job boards. I'm sure when you're advertising, you use at least one of them. So Indeed, CV Library and Total Jobs. So why would you then go and use someone else if those three job boards are the biggest and the best? Well, specifically attracting more diverse candidates to assist with balance is what you want to get as an outcome. And you might find that there are demographics that you might not reach via those more general job boards, but they may well be on a diversity specific job board. And it also shows candidates that you'll be supportive and that you're actually you're a diversity championing employer. So I've listed three there that are worth taking a look at, worth considering. Some of them are free, some of them charge, but worth looking at those when you're advertising next. So talent selection. Now I'm going to try and play this. It's a really interesting short video that talks about unconscious bias, and it'll give me a chance to rest my voice and have a drink. There is a link to it there, so I'm going to try and play it here, and if not, I've got it ready to open. Howard, are you able to see and hear that?
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more
no
information
problem.
than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1.10. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10 pence. The answer is actually 5 pence. Many of us choose 10 pence without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social, and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias. We can't cure unconscious bias, but with self-awareness, we can address it.
Okay, so hopefully you found that interesting. I did just put a note at the bottom here. Oh, I just pulled that because actually I was one of the most people that went, oh, really? How does that work then? And I actually had to go and Google it. So I thought, well, if there's anybody else who, like me, wasn't sure how that worked out, I'd put some notes there as to how that works. So talent retention. So 77% of employees and 80% of leaders who are disabled chose not to share their disability in the workforce. That's a lot of people. And don't forget, a lot of disabilities aren't necessarily seen. There are a lot of unseen disabilities. So for LGBTQ workers, 46% are closeted and at their place of work. Probably not a surprise, although I think that's improving. And across all diverse characteristics, 75% of employees feel the need to mask their differences or downplay them during work. So what can we do to help with that? So I think the first and the main important thing is that everybody feels welcome and valued. I've put walk the talk. So if you say you're going to do something, do it. And there's no point saying you're going to do it if you're not actually going to see that through. Celebrate differences. I mentioned the calendar there. Maybe pick a few of those out that you could trial celebrating. When you're thinking about succession planning, are there opportunities within leadership roles that you could earmark somebody in a minority group that you could then mentor to bring them to the forefront and give them that opportunity in the future? Flexible working, obviously flexible working is people have a right now to request flexible working at 26 weeks. There is talk that that's going to come in as a day one right as well. But actually there are a lot of individuals out there that could do a very good job for you with either some flexible working or, like I've put on there, some form of reasonable adjustment that will allow them to do their job well. And importantly, well-being, there is a lot more awareness now about well-being and a lot of organisations are doing more. But it comes down to, there's no point having some well-being strategy if that first point on there isn't being done. So it comes back to that, people must feel welcome and valued in the organisation. So I've generated a tick list for you with maximising potential. So promote your culture, review your website images and your wording. Advertise in more places. There's also a link there, as well as those job boards that I put the logos on. There's a link to an article that discusses those diverse job boards. Ensure your adverts are inclusive. It takes 5 minutes, if that, to run it through the gender decoder. Unconscious bias test. So this is quite an interesting one that is worth taking a look at if you've got a spare 5 minutes at some point. It's Project Implicit. It is one of those that asks you questions and you have to select one or the other, and as doing it as quickly as you can. It will actually tell you whether you are edging towards a bias or not, and there are different ones for different types of bias. Consider some unconscious bias training, or certainly awareness for people. You can then put elements into your process that could remove some of that opportunity for unconscious bias. So anonymising CVs and using panel interviews. I think that some work well, some don't. Certainly having more people involved with the process will help, but equally at the moment you don't want to make that process slow, because somebody else will snap up a good candidate before you do. I've put there, beware conformity bias. So it's a good thing to be aware of that. So if you are panel interviewing, you should have everybody send their scoring. I'm a big believer in ensuring that you score for interviewing. Should be sent to somebody to collate. The reason I say that is because if you have somebody more senior on that panel than other people, there tends to be a tendency that if the person senior scores something, scores a certain mark, then other people want to conform with that and score similarly. So be aware of that. So when it comes down to people's development, performance reviews, mentoring and promotions, all of those things can be taken into account with looking at where you are now and where you want to get to. And then it's important to retain people. We don't want to keep recruiting. If you can look after your people and develop them. I've mentioned EVPs there, employee value proposition. That is the, what do we offer our employees? People's well-being, reward culture, and most importantly, like I've said before, that safe environment. So I've mentioned a few links. There's a few links there to some articles that you may well find interesting and worth taking a little look at if you get a spare 5 minutes. So I'm on to questions now, Howard. I'll
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Sharing my screen, that's probably
Very informative. We have some questions, I think. Abraham, if you'd like to put the first one up. Yes, there will be a copy of the presentation available to you. So the first one is, do you think the CIOB data reflects the issue of the magnitude of the mindset shift needed by the construction sector?
That's a really interesting question. I think that it's probably two sides to it. So there's a mind shift needed in the construction sector, but also I think there's a mindset shift in general. So going back a number of years ago, I did some research and a presentation for the CIPD, where I went and interviewed female apprentices in the engineering industry. I interviewed female engineers in the industry, and I also interviewed some A-level and GCSE students and their parents. And the most staggering thing was comments made by the parents when I was talking to them about engineering, was that they were thinking, oh, well, yeah, of course I would recommend it to my son as a career to go into engineering, but I never really thought of it for my daughter. And, you know, you could see this realization come on their parents' faces of crikey, I've been quite biased there, really, and so really interesting. And I think that's where it starts. It's not just about encouraging individuals to get into the construction industry. It's about educating parents and teachers and anyone else who has an input into decision making of young people and what they want to do as careers.
Yeah, and I think the point you raised there is quite good. I mean, we've had this in the past. If you have your children and they come along and say, I think I'll join the construction sector, I think lots of people have in their mind, oh gosh, they're going to be working on a building site. Now that may be the case for some, but it's certainly not the case for many. Yep. It's an industry that really doesn't have a great, it's one of the biggest employers. It actually pays very well, but it doesn't have a great reputation. So I think that might be part of the shift that's needed.
Yeah, I think it's tackling it at all stages, isn't it? From that entry level all the way through. Which so it's a big task, but just these.
Yeah, it is. It is. I think the next question perhaps is part of the problem or part of the task. So if we have the next one, DEI is seen as soft by many senior people in the sector. Is the issue white middle-aged males who dominate sector management? The senior management in the sector?
That's a tough one, isn't it?
Well, so we've got unconscious bias here.
Yeah. So I think the soft element, yeah, probably, and actually that's why I started with the risk mitigation thing, because the bottom line is what most of the board, I don't know about you guys, but every board meeting I've sat in on, the first thing you talk about is finance. The last thing you talk about is people. And that's probably not the right way to do it. I'm sure the finance has still got to be the most important, but to have the people almost as AOB is probably not the right thing. So I think that yes, it probably is seen as soft. But by providing this education of the risk and also the potential, it shouldn't be. And is the issue white middle-aged males who dominate the senior management in the sector? I think that's the whole point of getting more women on boards, and also then looking at your workforce. What percentage is it? Can we increase the split of percentages, and can we then replicate that in the boardroom as well?
Okay, have we got any more questions? I mean, I think this question is actually quite interesting in itself, really, because education surely is part of the issue. And again, are people open to education on this topic or not? Is that another issue in itself?
Yeah, I think that's where it comes down to that what if. So what if we don't, and what if we do? And you know, and that's where it comes down to. So what? So whenever I go to see a customer, regardless of what they have invited me to go and talk to them about, I always ask them what their biggest challenges are in the organisation, because I can guarantee it will come down to people eventually, whether that is because of performance or being able to find the right staff, or even when it comes down to lack of customers, well, that's the sales performance. So it's always a good place to start. So by addressing, well, actually, if we can retain more people because we're taking into account our diversity and inclusion, or we can attract more good quality talent by improving that and then publicising it, has to be a good thing to address those potential issues.
Yeah, and I think this is, one of the key issues. How do you attract the talent the industry needs? And I think you're dead right. It is by, going in, as Boots has done, and acknowledging it's a diverse workforce.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, it's great when teams have different opinions. And, again, the sector's not great at listening to different opinions, nor cross-learning.
Yeah.
So I actually don't think we have any more questions. So you've probably covered it exceptionally well for everyone. So many thanks indeed. For those of you who still there, if you have a question, you've got an opportunity now. But what I would ask is if you could go to the poll and you could give us feedback. Secondly, if you would like to get a CPT certificate for today, Abraham, can you put that up, please? It will come up hopefully in a minute where you can go to My Pro Pass. Here we come. There we go. So if you'd like to get a certificate for attendance today, you can go along to My Pro Pass, create your free account, and you can store all your certificates there. Next week, we have Sandra Stevens from the CITV. Not quite sure on her topic, but we'll get it out to you as soon as we have it from her. So if there are no more questions, Rachel, many thanks indeed.
Yeah, no problem. If anybody wants to contact me, my details are on that presentation, even if it's just have a chat over what's been covered today. More than happy to do that.
Well, a great topic, and many thanks indeed. So I'm going to say to everyone, many thanks. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you again hopefully next Friday. Many thanks, Rachel.
Thanks very much.
Okay then.